In southern India, where people smoked less, consumed less sugar, and ate far less fat, the death rate from heart attacks was more than 6 times higher. And honestly, this just blows my mind. That someone decided it was okay to pour a toxic petroleum solvent, a known neurotoxin, into our food, and then sell the resulting oil and seed meal. It's oxidized linoleic acid inside LDL, not LDL itself, that initiates atherosclerosis. And if you never overload your LDL with linoleic acid, that process simply can't begin. We've got our foot on the gas and essentially no brakes. And all of this stems from one source, a cheap industrial supply of linoleic acid from seed oils. My name is Dr. Ravi Kumar. I'm a neurosurgeon in search of the causes of human illness and the solutions that help us heal and thrive. I want you to join me on a journey of discovery as I turn over every stone in search of the roots of disease and the mysteries of our resilience. The human body is a mysterious and miraculous machine with an amazing ability to self-heal. Let us question everything and discover our true potentials. Welcome to the Dr. Kumar Discovery. Welcome to the Dr. Kumar Discovery Podcast. My name is Dr. Ravi Kumar. I'm a board-certified neurosurgeon, and in this podcast, I aim to question medical dogma, break down bias, and bring clarity to complex issues. I want to question everything. That's something I've done throughout my own life, and it's something I want to share with you because I truly believe that knowledge is power, and when it comes to your health, having the right information can help you make better decisions, just like it has for me. Today's episode is the second part of a multi-part series on cardiovascular disease. In the previous episode, we looked at the diet-heart hypothesis and the role of saturated fat in disease. In that episode, I laid out how the belief that saturated fat causes heart disease is built more on bias, flawed studies, and outdated dogma than it is on solid science. If you haven't listened to that one yet, I highly recommend you go back and check it out. This episode builds on what we have covered there. Before we dive in, just a quick disclaimer. I'm a medical doctor, but I'm not your doctor. This show is for informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat any medical condition. I'm here to provide you with information that helps you think more clearly about your health. My goal is to give you the most honest and unbiased perspective I can, so you can take that knowledge, bring it to your own healthcare provider, and figure out the best strategy for your health goals. In the last episode, we talked about how we got to this point, where major health organizations in the United States, including the AHA, which is the American Heart Association, and the federal government, recommended limiting saturated fat intake. In fact, the AHA recommends keeping saturated fat intake below 6% of total calories. That's lower than what our ancestors would have consumed, so from an evolutionary and historical perspective, it doesn't quite add up. We explored how this belief took hold in the mid-20th century, when rates of heart attacks started rising. Around that time, a researcher named Ansel Keys published the 7-country study, which claimed that higher saturated fat intake was linked to increased risk of heart attacks. But as we discussed, this was a weak epidemiological study. It showed correlation, not causation. To truly test the diet-heart hypothesis, we needed randomized controlled trials. And 2 of those were launched in the mid to late 20th century, but their results were never properly published. So for decades, our national and even global health policy was shaped by incomplete, selectively reported data that showed only associations, but no causation. Fast forward to the mid-2010s, when a researcher at the NIH unearthed and reanalyzed the raw data from those 2 buried RCTs. These studies had been designed to prove that the saturated fat caused heart disease, but when the data were finally re-examined, they told a different story. In the Sydney Diet Heart Study, the group that had reduced saturated fat and increased polyunsaturated fat actually had more heart attacks and higher all-cause mortality. In the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, the group that had swapped saturated fats for polyunsaturated fat saw increased mortality in patients 65 and older. And in autopsies, there was no significant difference in the amount of atherosclerosis. These results essentially refuted the diet-heart hypothesis. So we ended that last episode with a major takeaway. Saturated fat does not cause heart disease. But we also left with a big question. If the 7-country study showed a correlation between saturated fat and heart disease, but the Sydney and Minnesota trials showed reverse relationships, then what was really going on? There had to be some unifying explanation here, and I think there is. So let's walk through it. The 7-country study looked at nations with very high rates of heart disease like the US, and countries with very low rates of heart disease like Greece, Italy, and Japan. In these low heart disease countries, people followed traditional diets built around whole, minimally processed foods, and much of their fat came from olive oil, which is mainly monounsaturated. That means it only has one double bond in the fatty acid chain and is relatively resistant to oxidation. In contrast, industrialized nations like Finland, the US, and Canada had higher rates of heart disease and consumed more saturated fat, which Ansel Keys linked to the increased risk of cardiovascular disease. But there's something else in these countries that they consumed, a factor that was not recorded in the study, but which we know was present from historical development of industrial food. They were eating a lot more seed oils. Seed oils are refined oils like soybean, corn, cottonseed, canola, and safflower. They had become widely available and were increasingly used in processed food. But these oils weren't common in places like Japan, Italy, or Greece at the time, and they weren't accounted for in Keyes' analysis. So while the 7-country study recorded saturated fat intake and linked it to heart disease, it failed to measure seed oil consumption, and that missing variable could have changed the story. Now fast forward to the randomized control studies that we talked about, the Sydney Diet Heart Study and the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. In both studies, saturated fats were intentionally replaced with seed oils. Safflower oil in the Sydney study and corn oil in the Minnesota one. And what happened? Replacing saturated fat with seed oils didn't improve heart outcomes. In fact, in the Sydney Diet Heart Study, the group that consumed more safflower oil had 70% higher rates of heart attacks and 62% higher all-cause mortality. In the Minnesota study, patients 65 or older had higher all-cause mortality in the groups consuming seed oils. So now we start to see a pattern. In both of the RCTs and in the 7-country study, the groups with higher mortality consumed more seed oil, and saturated fat was not a commonality. Now, to be clear, there were other dietary factors that contributed to heart disease: refined carbs, trans fats, ultra-processed foods. But in the Sydney and Minnesota trials, both groups consumed similar amounts of carbohydrates and trans fats. And what that means is those were effectively controlled for. The main variable, the one thing that appeared consistently across all studies in the higher mortality groups, was the consumption of seed oils. So that gives us a working hypothesis that maybe it wasn't saturated fat driving heart disease. Maybe seed oils were the real culprit, and saturated fat became the scapegoat. It's a hypothesis that fits all data sets, and I think it's a hypothesis worth exploring further. So let's first answer this question. What is a seed oil? Seed oils are oils extracted from seeds. Sounds obvious, right? But not all seeds are created equal when it comes to oil content. There are seeds we naturally think of as oily, like peanuts, sunflower seeds, sesame seeds. You can press them and easily get oil out. But then there are seeds you wouldn't expect to yield oil, like corn, soybeans, safflower, canola, cottonseed, even grape seeds. These don't seem oily at all, and in fact, they're not. They contain only a tiny amount of oil, mostly stored in a part of the seed called the germ. The germ of the seed is packed with fats and antioxidants, meant to nourish the seedling when it starts to grow. Now, most of these seeds would never be grown for their oil. There's just too little of it, and it would be a fool's errand. But they are rich sources of carbohydrates, and the food industry processes seeds like these into flours, seed mills, and starches. But there's a problem with that process. If you mill a seed and leave the small amounts of oil in the flour can go rancid. Once the seed is ground and exposed to air, the antioxidants that are used to protect the oil can't do their job anymore, and the fats oxidize, creating off flavors and shortening the shelf life of the flour. So the oils have to be removed. But remember, we're talking about tiny amounts of oil. You can't squeeze them out, but you can extract them. And this is where chemical engineering enters the food industry. To understand this next part, let's take a step back and talk about petroleum. When you extract crude oil from the ground, it contains a wide range of hydrocarbons. These are molecules made up of chains of carbon and hydrogen. Depending on their length, hydrocarbons can be used to make everything from lubricants to diesel to gasoline. The rule of thumb is the shorter the chain, the lighter and more volatile the hydrocarbon. That's why gasoline made of aromatic and short chain hydrocarbons like octane and hexane evaporates very easily and has that strong, unmistakable smell. Whenever you catch a whiff of gasoline, your body instinctively recoils. It feels toxic, and that's because it is. These volatile compounds are not something you'd ever want in your body, let alone your food. Now, this is where it gets a little unsettling. In gasoline, there's a hydrocarbon called hexane. It's a 6-carbon molecule. It's even lighter and more volatile than octane. And like gasoline, it has a sweet but harsh chemical smell. And it's a known neurotoxin. Prolonged exposure to high levels of hexane can cause severe nerve damage. But despite this, hexane is widely used in the food industry. Why? Because it's incredibly effective at extracting fats, especially those tiny amounts of oil hidden in seeds like soy, corn, and cottonseed. You see, hydrocarbons like hexane are lipid soluble. That means they dissolve fats easily. So at some point, some genius, and yes, I'm saying that sarcastically, came up with this idea. What if we grind up soybeans, which contain just a little bit of oil, and soak them in hexane? The logic was this. Hexane, being a fat solvent, would dissolve the oils from the soybean meal into solution. Then you'd wash off the hexane from the remaining seed meal, evaporate the hexane from the oil, and boom, you're left with soybean oil. And technically, it works. In fact, this is exactly how most seed oils are made today. It's an incredibly efficient process. Over 90% of the oil can be extracted from the seed. Then the hexane is evaporated, recondensed, and used for the next batch. And honestly, this just blows my mind. That someone decided it was okay to pour a toxic petroleum solvent, a known neurotoxin, into our food, and then sell the resulting oil and seed meal. I mean, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. To me, this is a textbook example of that principle. And to top off the insanity of this whole process, there's no label on a vegetable oil that says, hey, by the way, we poured a gasoline byproduct into this rapeseed and then evaporated it and sold you the oil. Nobody tells you that. And honestly, I think we deserve to know. And yet, that's the reality of how much of our cooking oil is made. Now, the official line is this. Hexane is evaporated off and only trace amounts remain, levels that are quote unquote generally considered safe for human consumption. That's the boilerplate statement you'll hear from regulators and industry spokespeople. But let me ask you this. If I walked up to one of those regulators or food chemists and said, here, pour some hexane into your oatmeal, let it evaporate, and then go ahead and eat it, or feed it to your kids, do you think any of them would do that? Absolutely not. Because even they know how absurd that is to pour toxic chemicals into food. It's honestly astonishing, but that's how it works, and you should know it. That's how we get seed oils. This kind of oil extraction simply wasn't possible before the early 1900s. We didn't have the technology, or we didn't have the chemical know-how. Or maybe we were just smarter back then. Maybe we understood that you don't pour poison into food. Either way, this process only became a reality with the industrialization of our food system. So that leads us to our next question. What happens when we suddenly start consuming massive amounts of seed oils that we never had access to before? Because think about it. When you eat whole foods like corn, wheat, or soy, you're getting tiny amounts of seed oil. But once we start extracting and concentrating those oils into liter-sized bottles, we created a food source and a quantity that simply didn't exist in evolutionary history. We went from barely touching these oils to consuming them by the spoonful every day in almost everything that we eat. So what's actually in these seed oils? The main component is a fatty acid called linoleic acid. Linoleic acid is an omega-6 polyunsaturated fat, and it's actually considered essential, meaning your body can't make it on its own, and it needs a small amount of it to carry out essential functions in the body. Throughout human history, we've consumed tiny amounts of linoleic acid, around 1 to 2 grams per day, mostly from whole plant foods or from animals that ate those plants. That's all we needed, and it worked just fine. The structure of linoleic acid is very important, and it explains why it does what it does in our bodies. It's a polyunsaturated fat, which means it contains more than one double bond along its carbon chain. Specifically, the first double bond appears at the 6th carbon from the end, hence the term omega-6. In contrast, a saturated fat has no double bonds, and a monounsaturated fat has only one double bond along its whole chain. This is significant because double bonds are weak points in a fat, where they can oxidize and reactions occur readily. So saturated fat is virtually immune from oxidation, and polyunsaturated fats like omega-6s and omega-3s are highly susceptible to oxidation. Linoleic acid specifically has 2 double bonds that bend the fat molecule into a curved shape called a cis configuration. These double bonds are separated by just one carbon atom, and that carbon is in a chemically fragile spot called the bisallylic position. Why does that matter? Because that structure makes linoleic acid highly prone to oxidation. It reacts readily with oxygen to form reactive oxygen species, unstable radical molecules that can trigger inflammation and cellular damage. In other words, this fat is chemically fragile, especially when extracted, heated, and consumed in large quantities. Now, linoleic acid isn't inherently bad. In fact, its structure, being highly oxidizable, serves a purpose in the body. The body uses linoleic acid as a raw material for creating functional molecules through a process called enzymatic oxidation. Specifically, it gets converted into arachidonic acid, which is then used to produce a group of signaling molecules called eicosanoids. These eicosanoids include prostaglandins, thromboxanes, and leukotrienes. Big words, I know, but their role is simple. They coordinate the body's inflammatory response. So yes, linoleic acid is pro-inflammatory by design. That's one of its biggest jobs in the body. Now, when people hear the word inflammation, the knee-jerk reaction is, that's bad. But inflammation is not the enemy. In fact, you can't survive without it. Inflammation is your body's way of healing. If you cut your arm, inflammation repairs it. You have a heart attack, inflammation helps rebuild the damaged tissue. Even microscopic injuries you're not even aware of, those too are healed through controlled inflammation all the time. It's a vital process that allows your body to recover, repair, renew, and stay functional. What is harmful, though, is unchecked inflammation, when inflammatory signals spread throughout the body in a chronic and unregulated way. That's when you shift into a state of systemic inflammation, which overwhelms the body's normal repair processes and contributes to the development of chronic disease. Everything from heart disease and diabetes to neurodegeneration and autoimmune diseases. So here's what we're dealing with. Linoleic acid, the omega-6 fatty acid that's highly concentrated in seed oils, is pro-inflammatory. It stimulates inflammation in the body. Now, for every yin, there has to be a yang. If inflammation gets turned on, there has to be a way to turn it off. Otherwise, you end up with a runaway fire. That's where omega-3 fatty acids come in. While omega-6 fats, like linoleic acid, promote inflammation, omega-3s help resolve it. They cool things down. And like omega-6s, omega-3s are also polyunsaturated and oxidizable. But when they're oxidized, either enzymatically or sometimes spontaneously, they form compounds that suppress inflammation, not amplify it. So the body relies on a natural balance between these two types of fats. Omega-6s like linoleic acid spark inflammation and begin repair. And omega-3s like ALA and its metabolites EPA and DHA calm the process once the healing is underway. This balance helps keep us in a state of homeostasis, enough inflammation to heal, but not so much that it becomes chronic and damaging. Now, before seed oils infiltrated our food at such high levels, this balance was intact. For most of human history, we consumed an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of 1 to 1, maybe as high as 4 to 1, depending on the diet and region. But with the explosion of seed oils, especially soybean oil, that ratio skyrocketed. Now we estimate the average omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in the modern diet to be anywhere from 20 to 1 to 30 to 1. That's a massive shift away from what our bodies are evolved to handle. And this isn't just theoretical. A fascinating study looked at changes in human body fat composition over the last half century. Researchers found that linoleic acid levels in adipose tissue, that's our fat, increased by 136% since the late 1950s. That's not subtle. It's a fundamental change in our biological composition. And the increase tracked closely with rising seed oil consumption, especially soybean oil. So what happens when that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio gets thrown off? Your system is flooded with omega-6s, and the protective effects of omega-3s get crowded out. It's not just about how much omega-6 we're consuming, it's that we're drowning out our body's natural fire extinguishers, omega-3s. If omega-6 fats push the inflammation pedal, and omega-3s are the brakes, then in today's diet, we've got our foot on the gas and essentially no brakes. And all of this stems from one source, a cheap industrial supply of linoleic acid from seed oils. So that's the first part of the story, that linoleic acid naturally promotes inflammation via evolutionarily designed pro-inflammatory pathways. But there's another part to the story. Remember how I mentioned how linoleic acid is extremely prone to spontaneous oxidation? Just exposure to oxygen, heat, and light is enough to oxidize it. This leads to the formation of highly reactive byproducts that trigger even more inflammation. When linoleic acid oxidizes, it produces a class of harmful compounds called oxalams, oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, that are often concentrated within the LDL particles. And remember, LDL is one of the lipoproteins that transports cholesterol from the liver to the rest of the body for repair and maintenance, because cholesterol is essential to maintenance of cells and their membranes. Now, how does oxidation of linoleic acid within LDL particles contribute to atherosclerosis? To understand this, we need to talk about the endothelium. This is the inner lining of the blood vessels. The endothelium is a highly reactive metabolic surface that regulates vascular tone, blood clotting, immune responses. It constantly walks a fine line between oxidative stress and repair. So it is constantly calling out for LDL molecules that carry the cholesterol it needs to maintain its integrity. But when it's hit with a steady stream of LDL molecules with high oxidative potential due to their linoleic acid content, that balance is lost, setting the stage for vascular injury. One clinical study drove this point home. Researchers compared diets rich in linoleic acid from seed oils to diets rich in oleic acid, the main monosaturated fat in olive oil. They found that participants eating oleic acid had LDL particles that were far more resistant to oxidation. Their LDL held up better under oxidative stress, and their HDL, the good cholesterol, maintained its function. In short, swapping seed oils for oleic-rich fats made the body's lipoproteins less likely to turn toxic. So let's walk through what actually happens in the body step by step when you consume a large amount of linoleic acid, and how that can lead to atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. Let's say you're making a batch of brownies and pour in a cup of vegetable oil loaded with linoleic acid. You bake it, eat it, and now you've just given your body a massive bolus of omega-6 fat. That linoleic acid gets absorbed in your small intestine, packaged into chylomicrons, and eventually makes its way into LDL particles. Because you consume so much linoleic acid, two things happen. Your omega-6 levels spike, pushing your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio even further out of balance. And two, linoleic acid competes for the enzymes needed to convert plant-based omega-3s like ALA from chia seeds or walnuts or whatever you've eaten into active anti-inflammatory forms of EPA and DHA. So not only are you overloading your system with omega-6, but you're also blocking your body's ability to generate omega-3s that it needs to keep inflammation in check. Now, LDL, which is carrying a high load of linoleic acid, continues circulating. Let's say something happens, a stressor, a hard workout, maybe you're exposed to smoke or pollution. This creates oxidative stress and causes minor injury to your blood vessel lining, the endothelium. That's not unusual. The endothelium is a delicate, one-cell thick layer, and it gets figuratively nicked all the time. Normally, it heals quickly, and cholesterol is essential to that repair process. But remember, every cell in your body needs cholesterol to survive, and especially to heal, including the endothelium. So LDL shows up not to cause damage, but to deliver cholesterol where it's needed. But here's the problem. The LDL particle isn't just carrying cholesterol, it's also packed with linoleic acid, and the endothelium is already in an oxidatively stressful environment. It's constantly generating nitric oxide to regulate blood pressure and vessel dilation. This nitric oxide is a reactive molecule and it contributes to a high oxidation zone. In healthy systems, antioxidants like vitamin C, vitamin E, and glutathione keep that oxidative stress in check. But when LDL carrying linoleic acid enters this environment, those unstable polyunsaturated fats are like dry kindling. Linoleic acid oxidizes rapidly, reacting with free radicals like superoxide, and this alters the LDL particle. Specifically, it modifies the ApoB100 protein, making the LDL no longer recognizable to receptors on the nearby cells that actually need to take up the LDL and use the cholesterol. The LDL molecule ends up just sitting there, damaged and unclaimed. The surrounding cells need cholesterol, but they can't receive the LDL's payload now that its linoleic acid contents have turned into an oxidative bomb. Your body recognizes this as a problem, so it calls in for help. Macrophages, immune cells designed to clean up debris. They engulf the oxidized LDL, but they're quickly overwhelmed. Oxidized LDL is not a molecule macrophages evolved to handle at this scale. The oxidative damage overwhelms them, and they quickly turn into foam cells, bloated, immobile, dysfunctional, and this creates what we call a fatty streak, the first visible signs of atherosclerosis. Over time, smooth muscle cells and fibroblasts build a wall around this toxic debris to contain the damage, and eventually that area calcifies. And that's how atherosclerosis begins. Now let's imagine a very different scenario. In fact, let's go back to the Tokelau Islanders, who we talked about in the last episode. They live in the South Pacific and get about 60% of their calories from saturated fat. But here's the key. They consume minimal linoleic acid. They still get their essential 1 to 2 grams per day from plants, but nowhere near the 17 grams the average American now eats daily. And because of their high saturated fat intake and low linoleic acid intake, their LDL is far less prone to oxidation. Why? Because saturated fat doesn't oxidize. It has no double bonds. So it's chemically stable, even in a high oxidative environment. Now here's the kicker. These Tokelauans smoke a lot, if you remember. Smoking is one of the worst things you can do for vascular health. It generates an enormous amount of oxidative stress. But even with high LDL levels and heavy smoking, they have essentially no heart disease. Why? Because their LDLs don't carry oxidizable linoleic acid. So when injury occurs, LDL delivers the cholesterol, supports repair, and moves on. No oxidation, no immune cell confusion, no foam cells, and no cardiovascular disease. It's not that saturated fat is protecting them. It's that they've replaced the linoleic acid with saturated fat and made their LDL particle essentially resistant to oxidation. That's the key. It's oxidized linoleic acid inside LDL, not LDL itself, that initiates atherosclerosis. And if you never overload your LDL with linoleic acid, that process simply can't begin. In fact, researchers have found that the greater the concentration of oxalams in arterial plaques, the worse the disease. So it's not just about how much LDL is in your blood. We have to ask, what's inside the LDL? And if it's packed with the linoleic acid, it's basically a loaded gun. You can now see how this molecule, linoleic acid, has become an unnatural disruptor of human biology. It clogs up the normal biochemistry of our cholesterol transport system, drives vascular disease, and sets the stage for heart disease. What we've done is introduce something completely unnatural, something that was never available in abundance before, and it's created a massive human health crisis. Now you might say, what about other bad habits, like smoking? Sure, smoking is terrible for you. If you smoke, you should stop right now. But humans have always been exposed to smoke, from campfires, cooking fires, ritual practice. For millennia, this has been around us. Smoke isn't new to human biology. Same with sugar and carbs. Yes, refined carbohydrates are harmful when consumed in excess, but brief periods of overconsumption have always existed. Harvesting fruit in season, raiding a beehive and eating honey in a single feast. In contrast, what's truly new to our biology is the massive and sustained intake of linoleic acid from seed oils. One study showed that per capita soybean oil consumption increased by 1,000-fold from 1909 to 1999 in the US. That's not a subtle shift, and our biology has no evolutionary playbook for dealing with this. The result? A complete distortion of our inflammatory balance. Too much flame and not enough extinguisher, and it's slowly destroying our health. So why hasn't anyone told us to stop eating so much linoleic acid? The evidence has been around for decades. Some of the most revealing studies go all the way back to the 1960s. Let me tell you about one of them, and it's a story I really like. In India during the 1960s, the Indian Ministry of Railways managed healthcare for all their railway workers across the country. They also collected health data as part of their system-wide care model. Researchers began to notice something strange. Rates of heart attacks were dramatically higher in South India compared to North India. A researcher named Dr. Malhotra decided to dig deeper. He looked at smoking habits, physical activity, diet, and health metrics of over 1 million people. And what he found completely contradicted the prevailing scientific consensus. In North India, people smoked 9 times more than their southern counterparts. They also ate 19 times more fat, mostly saturated fat from ghee and milk, and they consumed 9 times more sugar. By all modern standards, they should have had sky-high rates of heart disease. But the opposite was true. In many parts of North India, heart attacks were considered a curiosity. They were so rare. Yet in southern India, where people smoked less, consumed less sugar, and ate far less fat, the death rate from heart attacks was more than 6 times higher. They had a 675% increase in heart attacks compared to North India. So what was the difference? It was the fat. In North India, it came almost exclusively from saturated fat, animal fats like ghee, milk, and meat. In southern India, it came largely from seed oils, especially peanut and sesame oil, fats high in linoleic acid. This was during the exact same period when the diet heart hypothesis, pushed by Ansel Keys, the American Heart Association, and others, was gaining global traction. The idea that saturated fat caused heart disease and that polyunsaturated fats, like seed oils, were protective. But Dr. Malhotra's data said the opposite. He saw that those eating the most saturated fats had the lowest rate of heart attacks, while those eating the most seed oils had the highest rate of heart attacks. And to his credit, he didn't bury the data. He published his findings and directly challenged the mainstream narrative, pointing out that his massive compendium of real-world data contradicted the global consensus. But you've probably never heard of this study, right? That's because it was ignored, washed over by decades of scientific consensus built on the idea that saturated fat is harmful and polyunsaturated fat is healthy. And while a chorus of zealots sung the praises of highly polyunsaturated seed oils, Southern Indians who had never before consumed them in such large quantities fell victim to a surge in cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysfunction, and chronic illness. This was a real-world, society-wide experiment with a built-in control group. And ignoring this kind of historical evidence means missing out on incredibly valuable insights about health and disease. So here's the question. Why isn't your doctor telling you to stop eating seed oils? Why aren't they saying, hey, maybe ditch the vegetable oil and improve the oxidation status of your LDL before we talk about statins? The truth is, they probably don't know. Most physicians were never taught this. I can tell you from personal experience, this isn't covered in medical school. And it's certainly not in the glossy pamphlets handed out by pharmaceutical reps alongside jugs of Starbucks coffee and bagels. To understand what I've shared with you in this episode, I had to dig. I had to dig deep. And I had to read hundreds of research papers, many of them decades old, just to connect the dots. And honestly, I've only scratched the surface. So why isn't this information more widely broadcasted? Well, I think there's powerful economic interests at play here. First, hexane, the solvent used to extract seed oils, is a byproduct of petroleum refining, something that might otherwise go to waste. It's sold to the food industry as a cheap and efficient tool. Second, seed meals, what's left after oil extraction, is used to produce flours, starches, and processed food. But you can't leave fats in them or they go rancid. So the oils get pulled out. And instead of discarding them, the industry bottles them up, brands them as vegetable oil, and lines grocery store shelves with them. So now we're pouring this refined industrial fat extracted with a petroleum solvent into our brownie mixes, our frying pans, and in our kids' snacks, without realizing we're feeding the fires of oxidative stress and chronic disease. But listen, my goal is not to stoke outrage with this. Yes, I believe that some anger is justified, and when it's focused, it can lead to change. But I'm telling you this so you can take ownership of your own health. The food industry, they're not looking out for you. They're not prioritizing long-term health. They're optimizing for shelf stability, cost, and profit. And this goes far beyond seed oils. Refined carbs, synthetic preservatives, artificial colors, it's a long list. But here's the thing. No one is forcing us to buy these seed oils. No one is making us pour it into our cakes or cook our food with it or feed it to our kids. We're doing it because we've been told it's healthy. Now, I'm giving you a different set of information, unbiased information, and you get to choose what you do with it. Okay, I know that got a little intense, and honestly, I don't like being negative. That's not what this is about. But I do want you to understand the truth about what these seed oils are, what they do to your body, and why it matters. So the next question is, what can we do? Well, one, we can ditch the seed oils. Start by finding that bottle of vegetable oil in your pantry and throw it out. Pour it into your compost pile, make a candle or an oil lamp out of it. Get creative. Do whatever you want. Just don't put it in your body, and definitely don't feed it to your kids. Two, replace it with stable, real fats. Use fats that are less prone to oxidation, like olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, grass-fed ghee, or grass-fed butter. These fats are either monounsaturated or saturated, which makes them far more stable. If your LDL is carrying these fats, even in the setting of vascular injury, you're much less likely to initiate atherosclerosis. And three, take a high-quality omega-3 supplement. Omega-3s help bring your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio back into balance, which is key for calming inflammation. But quality matters. omega-3 fats like omega-6s are prone to oxidation. So look for a supplement that's tested for oxidative stability. Many companies cut corners here, and you don't want to consume rancid fish oil. A good omega-3 taken daily can benefit you, your kids, and your entire family. It helps level the inflammatory playing field and moves your body further towards homeostasis. And 4, choose grass-fed wild meats when possible. This one might be less critical than others, but it still matters. Animals that are fed corn and soy, like most conventional pork, chicken, and beef, accumulate linoleic acid in their tissue, just like we do. So when you eat their meat, you're inheriting that skewed omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. When possible, choose grass-fed meats, pasture-raised poultry, and wild-caught fish or game. Now, the next question you might be asking is this: do I have to be a monk to avoid linoleic acid? Because let's be honest, these seed oils are everywhere. They're in almost every packaged food, every restaurant meal, every birthday cake, every tray of fries. It can feel overwhelming. Here's my advice. The answer is no, you don't have to be a monk. You don't need to live in fear of linoleic acid. And you certainly don't need to walk around dreading every bite of food you didn't prepare for yourself. In fact, that kind of fearful mindset, cutting yourself off from social gatherings, from joy, from spontaneity, might be more harmful to your well-being than the occasional exposure to seed oils. Life is meant to be lived. So yes, go to the party, eat the birthday cake, share the fries with your friends now and then. Just don't make that your norm. The key is moderation. At home, you have control, so take control. Like I said earlier, stop cooking with seed oils in your kitchen. That one change alone can make a huge impact on your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which over time can dramatically shift your inflammatory environment and improve your health. Outside the home, live your life, but don't glorify gluttony. And don't fall into the trap of thinking, it's everywhere, so I might as well not even try. Find the middle ground, a very valuable principle that can be applied to all aspects of your life. Okay, so that brings us to our final question. If the real problem is oxidized linoleic acid, then why is my doctor telling me to lower my LDL with a statin? And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next episode. But here's a short answer. It all comes down to a misguided philosophy in modern medicine. One that says, when the sink is overflowing, don't pull the plug, just mop the floor. Now, a quick disclaimer. If you're currently on a statin, do not stop taking it just because of what you heard here. Talk to your doctor, get informed, and make decisions together. Remember, I'm not giving medical advice. I'm here to offer you information so you can think more clearly and critically about your health. Thank you for joining me on this journey of discovery. It's been eye-opening for me, and I hope it has been for you too. Please take this information, use it, share it, and empower yourself to make better, more informed decisions about your health. Cheers, and see you next time.